Hi, thanks for stopping by. My name is Jerrel. I'm a commercial games developer, and today I wanted to share my analysis and some thoughts on the Pokemon games that have just launched this month. They would be Pokemon Scarlet and Pokemon Violet. I'm playing the Violet version here, and I want to contribute to the conversation that we are seeing online. Though I'm a game developer, I'm still very much into playing games and enjoying the games, especially if they are in the series that I grew up with. So much of the conversation we are seeing online is regarding the performance issues and why the uh, Pokemon games seem to be a bit rough in terms of presentation. Now, I'm a games developer. I create games for Nintendo consoles, but I have no connection to Game Freak. Um, I have immense respect for Game Freak as developers, and I regard them as seniors. So it I have all the respect in the world for them. And so this video will not be any sort of scathing indictment or criticism of Game Freak. I believe that what they have accomplished here is incredible, and I will be going through many reasons as to why what they've accomplished is incredible. It is a monumentous accomplishment, what they have achieved. Regardless of any glitches and performance issues, what they've done is great. As a developer, I understand how difficult it is to work in certain development environments and for creating software for certain platforms. So what they have created, I can understand from a certain standpoint that what they've done is incredible. And in many ways, I can't believe they were able to achieve something this grand. From a gamer standpoint, it's you don't really understand and see the technical challenges and difficulties. So that's what I want to share in this video and explain just what is so special about these games and what Game Freak was able to achieve is so impressive. And again, from a gamer standpoint, they're all small things that don't really aren't that visible to gamers, but they are all things that contribute to the end product of why we are playing a game that at launch has some blemishes in terms of performance and presentation. But the thing is, those are things that can be fixed. I will be presenting my analysis of what is causing these issues, the decisions that led to these issues arising, and how they could be addressed in this software and for potential titles, how these issues could be avoided entirely. I have a few years of experience in terms of overly optimizing it and trying to get software to run the absolute best, especially when development environments are quite challenging. So later in the video, I will be sharing one of my projects to show you how difficult it can be to try to create something with such a large open space, to have so much detail. I will share that later on. So please stick around, and I hope you enjoy the video. So I have some notes here, so please don't mind me as I read through my notes, as I have quite a bit that I would like to discuss with you. Now, the first thing I want to focus on is the overall performance and what could be causing these issues. So when it comes to the performance of a game, you're mainly going to see issues with um, uh, either the graphics processing unit or the central processing unit, the GPU, the CPU. Um, and I want to try to steer away from overly complicated jargon. I don't want to sort of throw all these technical terms in your face. I'm going to try to simplify terminology. So basically, and also, just to be clear, I'm going to be very careful because I won't be revealing anything that is um, um, secured and protected by a non-disclosure agreement. Any sort of super top secrets that have to be with developing for Nintendo hardware, I won't be disclosing any of those details. So I'll just be speaking in general terms, but also sharing my insight, having developed on numerous Nintendo platforms. So in general, when a game um, is struggling to run at full speed in terms of all frames per second, we all want 60 frames per second. It's the dream. The challenges that a game will be running into are the amount of what you would call your animated geometry. Um, you have high poly count geometry, and those things are the most basic and simple things. Now, the Switch is actually very good at running fairly high poly count single models. Difficulty comes when you have many models and they all have pretty high, I'm going to call it poly count. A high poly count means that the geometry is very detailed. Now, having, say, for example, a piece of geometry like this Pokemon Center here, now that is not animated, so it's less demanding on any hardware to render. When you have a player character that is animated, and then you have a bunch of NPCs that are animated, that is significantly more demanding, especially when you have heaps of them. Now, the frame rate that you're seeing here, it's going to be quite a bit rough because my capture device is pretty cheap. It's not one of the great ones. I just happened to grab one that happened to be available to me at the time. So the frame rates that you're seeing here, they're much worse because of my capture device. What is also quite expensive and adds up pretty quickly is physics simulation. So what we see, they're not it's not like a Gary's Mod situation where you have all these, physics simulations and all these things crashing into each other and whatnot. In terms of physics simulation, I'm referring to, say, for example, as you see the hair on the character move, that's not real physics. There are no real physics in these games, but it's a form of physics simulation. I noticed through my analysis that many characters will have physics simulation. The more important and detailed NPC characters will have physics simulation. You can see there's a bit of tearing as well that's coming from my graphics card. Even NPCs that you challenge out in the field as they are closer to the camera, I can see that they do have physics simulation, and my concern is that physics simulation being disabled when it's too far from the camera for the player to be able to tell. I have tried to figure out, but the resolution is too low for me to be able to tell. This character has short hair, so his hair would not be physics simulation. But there is a trainer that looks like a fusion between Android 17 and 18. I forgot what trainer class that is, but that character has long hair, and I did notice as that character turns, the hair is physics simulated. And my concern is that perhaps, as I feel that when your character is a certain distance from the camera, the physics simulation should be turned off on those. I can't really tell because, again, the resolution is too low for me to be able to tell on that. Shadows are extremely expensive. Now you can see that my character has his shadows here. The NPCs have shadows. The foliage, the Pokemon have shadows. Pretty much everything has shadows. The geometry has shadows. That all costs, and it really builds up. If you have just like one thing, if you have only this character, it's not that big of a deal. But once you have geometry and everything is casting, everything has to be processed. That all adds up, and it becomes much more expensive. You will notice that as you get a particular distance, shadows will no longer be drawn. It's hard to tell here. I'll zoom up a little bit, and we'll see the shadows appear. So as I approach the Pokemon Center, you can see the shadows are no longer being drawn. So that's actually quite a short draw distance for shadows. So that is an optimization decision. When you shorten the distance at which shadows can be drawn, it improves performance because there's less processing that needs to occur. But the problem with that is if you are not drawing shadows in the distance, then that's when your landscape looks very flat. That is one of the complaints that I have seen online, is the graphics look bad. Part of the reason why some people feel that way is because you look at that and it looks quite flat because now there are no shadows underneath those trees, especially if you're in particular landscapes. I'll try to travel to a particular part of the landscape where it is more apparent and it does matter more. I'll try to avoid running into anything here. And you can see scenes look interesting and dynamic when we have shadows. Um, it is the interaction between light and shadow that make a scene interesting, between light and dark, between colors that contrast, colors that blend. That is what makes a scene interesting to look at. So I'll see, I don't want to back into anything over here. I'll see how, I feel like this scene is quite interesting to look at. There are light, there are dark areas. If I back away, you can see the shadows no longer being drawn. I hope I don't run into anything here. And you can see how the scene pretty quickly loses that dynamic visual contrast, and it starts to look flat. that contributes to why people feel like the graphics are not very good, is things in the distance, they lack their shadows and they tend to look flat. Once you have a flat image, it's no longer interesting to look at. Something that significantly impacts performance, I'll look at my map here now, is any sort of special renderer that is used for water. Here is the challenge with this. There's water all over the place. Water is quite expensive to render depending on how you're doing it. And that involves um, any reflections that it's reflecting from the environment, how complex you want those reflections. Do you want to simulate waves and ripples in the water? Let me just double check my map again. I want to make sure that I am going in the right direction. We'll head to the red thing. I do like this compass system. There are colors on the compass. I think that is very well considered. And there are many things that I want to discuss here. So um, I'll just run from this guy. I've bumped into a cricket dot. Now, water it looks nice. We want water to look nice. It is a huge part of immersion and adding interest to a scene. Now, the water here, it does have some degree of reflection, and let's see, if I go into the water, you can see that it does have ripples. It doesn't seem to simulate. It's hard to tell here. It's hard to tell. All right, so it doesn't modify the geometry. There's no sort of geometry modification, which would have been more expensive, for example, simulating waves on the ocean. So it appears to be a more simple mesh, but there are reflections, and those can be quite expensive. Now, the difficulty with the rendering here, I do not believe that they are culling the water geometry in moments where it would be beneficial. We have seen the camera clip through the floor, and you can see in the distance that water geometry is still being rendered, which means that if I am in a if I am in a scene where I'm already having to draw, as we discussed before, uh, having animated geometry uh, can be quite expensive once it all starts adding up. It very quickly adds up, so that you can have a high poly count geometry, you can have animated geometry, and if I face this direction, I've seen in situations, so I know for a fact the water that we were looking at earlier, which as I mentioned can be very expensive. Once you have heaps of it, you have different bodies of water. Um, Once I'm over here and I have to draw all these things, now I've got multiple characters in the scene. I have a high poly count geometry in terms of the buildings, and even the Pokemon themselves are quite high poly count. It's still drawing that water over there. That water, it should have been culled, but it's still being drawn, which means all of these things are adding up, and that would mean that waterfalls. I have seen in the distance waterfalls um, are simplified, but it's still drawing some basic form of the water. There's a high poly count here, and there will be water in the distance. Let's uh, go ahead and move over here. And oop, I keep pushing the wrong button there, don't I? I'm using a funny third-party controller here. Right. So now I'm drawing my player character, my high poly count Pokemon. I have my foliage. Those the poly counts on those buildings all add up, and it's still drawing the water mesh. This is the issue that we're running into: is we are drawing far too many things because the environments are now, unlike previous Pokemon games, they're very dynamic. We have full control of the camera, which is not something we've had in previous Pokemon games before, and it's not something that I think the Game Freak development team has had extensive experience with in terms of optimizing, because we are drawing too much now. There's too much that we're drawing, which puts a strain on the hardware, which of course causes the frame rate to drop. Now, this is a major part of performance that I want to discuss, and I'll spend a bit of time on it. I'll probably come back to it a bit, is this dither transparency on the foliage. It seems like a good solution for an issue, and that issue is that some Pokemon are very small. One, or I think two of the major design decisions that have led to the issues that we're seeing here. First is the open world environment. It absolutely dominates every decision behind how you design the game, every decision behind the game. And secondly, the Pokemon are to scale. That seems like it's a great thing because we as players have been asking for to-scale Pokemon for years and years, but that causes immense issues. Um, if I bring out a small Pokemon, I keep pressing the Y button, I don't know why I'm doing that. Let's go ahead and grab a small-sized Pokemon and we'll put him out into the field and I'll show you by example what I mean here. Let's get a Diglett. And you can see there's grass here, right? Let's fight this guy. Now you can see once battles start, the grass dither becomes more aggressive. If the grass did not dither, you would see that my Diglett would not be visible. You can see the dots there, and there's a screen door effect. The reason why the development team made that decision is because if they did not dither the grass, dither transparency, then you wouldn't see the Diglett and you wouldn't see the Igglybuff. There are plenty of Pokemon that are very small. Palmy, I noticed early on in the game, you get him pretty early, he would disappear into the grass. Now they want the Pokemon to be visible, but the problem is that this dither transparency effect has a cost. It has a performance cost. And every single piece of geometry that I have seen in this game so far has the potential to become dithered transparency, but all of that has a cost. There's a cost to calculate the distance to the camera. There is a cost to calculate what is the tolerance for dithering, and then it has to adjust how much of that screen door effect should be applied. All of that has a performance cost. And the problem is now that everything is doing that. The grass is doing it, the any sort of foliage, any sort of plant, they're all doing it. And there's so much that has to now calculate and take that into account. That's causing a performance cost. And the decisions behind that, I understand. It's unfortunate that this is the solution that we had to go with. For me personally, if I were to design a game and I had these requirements on the title, what I would have done is when the Pokemon starts the battle, the opponent Pokemon maybe lets out a roar and they tear up the grass around them. So there is a space of grass around them where the grass gets partially destroyed. So you just see the very smallest, stumps of the grass, kind of like in Breath of the Wild when you slice and burn grass or what have you. There's a little bit of grass left. There's just a little, a stub of the grass. So maybe the wild Pokemon roars and it cuts the grass, and then there can be a cool dramatic effect where now the blades of grass are flying in the wind, and now they don't have to dither transparency that grass because now it's no longer too long. Then when your Pokemon launches out of the Pokeball emits some burst of energy, and maybe it clears out some of the grass in the general area. So now the grass is short around your Pokemon, which means now your Pokemon no longer would be too small because the grass has been cut. That is a potential solution. And I'm not saying these are things that Game Freak should do. I'm not saying this is my wish list. I would say as a developer, if I were to be faced with these requirements, that is a decision that I would have tried to see if it was a viable solution. Because dithering is has a substantial performance cost. Anything that you have to test the distance to the camera, then you calculating how much transparency, that all costs. And the more things that have to do that, the more expensive that is going to be. To add to that, we have environmental effects such as dust particles. We have environmental particles. Some environments have grass blades blowing in the wind. I don't see any dust blowing here, but all of those things contribute. One of the most expensive things to render is transparent geometry. So say, for example, these things here. Now, this is a major issue. This is going to be one of the biggest contributors to the problems with the performance and frame rate, are these things. These are so innocuous, you would think they're not a big deal, but they are emitting multiple particles that are transparent. They have a significant cost because it's quite difficult for game consoles to render transparent things. You wouldn't think it was that big of a deal. But in this case, there is also a blending going on in terms of multiplying the values of the colors. So say, for example, that gives this a glowing effect. You could have a blending effect where the particles look dark and they darken the environment. In this case, they're performing some math, and the hardware has to draw these transparent particles. But the problem is, if you have a look around, they're all over the place. We've all played the game for a while, so we know that items are abundant and they're all over the place. These are important. We have to see these things from a distance, because then that lets us know, oh, there's something of interest, I need to go over there. But the problem is that is still being drawn, even if I'm not supposed, even if I shouldn't see it. So you see that there, those particles there, that's going to be expensive to draw because it's transparent particles. Anything transparent is just going to be substantially more expensive. So say I'm here, we don't even know now that those transparent particles are on the other side of that mountain, but the hardware is still drawing it. Now we saw one on the other side over there as well. We also have, Pip, please. Killing me. All right, so you see we have an item there which has a rendering cost. We have that, I think it's indicating a den. That has a rendering cost. And if I position the camera like so, they're now blocked by the geometry, but I know those things are still there. It's still having to render those things, and now there's potential for NPCs to be visible. There could be water being drawn back there, and we can't see it. It's not being occluded. We know it's not being occluded because when the camera clips through the geometry, through the floor, we can still see those things being drawn. All of those things have a cost. So that's where we are finding performance issues. It's not that the Switch can't handle this stuff, because as everyone and their mother has said, we have games like Breath of the Wild that look incredible and run great. This is one of the issues that we're seeing with this game, is that things that probably should be occluded, that should no longer be drawn, they're still being drawn. Now my frame rate in the game is, it's dropped a fair bit, and that is because I know that it's drawing all those particles that are transparent, that are expensive. There could be even more items and more dens that I don't know about, that I haven't identified, but they could still be somewhere in the distance, and the game still has to draw them to let the player know, hey, there's something interesting over there that you might want to look at. And again, that issue arises because of the decision to make a fully open world game and to follow the approach that Breath of the Wild took, where it shows the player something interesting in the distance and to let the player decide whether or not they want to go there and see what that thing is. To add to that, there are particle effects for Pokemon, and some have, when they move, they dig through the ground. Those are particle effects. They can have a cost as well. And there are wind simulation for the foliage as well. Calculating the wind, if we have a look here, you can see that these trees are blowing, the grass is blowing, these bushes are blowing. All of that has a cost. Every small thing has a cost. When it comes to developing a game, you have a budget. You have a CPU budget and you have a GPU budget. You have, say for example, you need to process AI. That uses the CPU. If you need to process, these transparencies and these particles and all those things, and your animated characters, that would be the GPU. You have a very particular budget, and you have to be very careful how you spend that budget. When you make a design decision, you have to ask yourself, is it worth spending my budget? This is going to be very expensive. Is it worth it? Will the player notice and appreciate the thing that I've spent my budget on? If the answer is no, the player probably won't notice this thing, then that isn't worth wasting your budget on. Now, I've run here to the Pokemon Center and I've discussed the budget with you, because one of the major issues that I've noticed with this game is that they spend their budget, in terms of the space they have available for texture memory, they spend that budget on things that aesthetically they're quite nice, but how much do they contribute to the end product, and will the player even appreciate them? Because these posters, there are posters like that. These are actually, they're relatively high resolution. These aren't low resolution. They're quite clear. You can still see the text, even though they don't have, legible. It's some made up language. It's still high resolution textures, and there are heaps of them. And the fact that they are always present, because you are almost always near a Pokemon Center, these textures pretty much almost have to be loaded into memory, which means those things are basically permanently taking up space in the memory. Now you think, okay, maybe it's not that big of a deal, but you have to take into account, I think, I don't know off the top of my head, I think there's 435 or so Pokemon in the Pokédex, and because of the nature of the game, that means that any and all of those Pokemon, not all, but any combination of them and any magnitude of them could appear in one place. You have Pokemon that roam around, you have battles, you have multiplayers, so other characters can come into the same area. They can have graphically demanding Pokemon who all have their own um, cost to render and to load their textures. And then you have things like these posters that don't really contribute to the gameplay, that are constantly taking up space in the memory, which puts pressure on your memory for your textures. Which means that the more pressure you have on your memory, the more you will have to unload textures that you aren't using that very second, and the more you'll have to load in other textures. Now, the reason why we see memory corruption and things disappear is if the hardware struggles and it is unable to load something in that it needs. Another serious issue that I have identified here are the TM thumbnails. Now, these may seem like they're not that big of a deal. They're totally innocuous. But in terms of the platform that we're looking at and the texture memory, the space for memory that's available for textures, these take up a lot of space. They're not low resolution. They're pretty high. They're detailed. They're pretty high resolution for the purpose that they serve. The purpose that they serve is just to make them identifiable so people can clearly see them without having to read text. I think aesthetically, it's really nice. As a gamer, I really like this. I like seeing these thumbnails, but the problem is that making a decision such as these high resolution thumbnails for TMs is a bad design decision because it puts pressure on every single other aspect of the game. That can, because these show up so often, they can happen anytime, which means that even though let's say that, oh, we only load the thumbnails in when this is open. The problem with that is that in the background, we are still in the same environment as everyone else, which means if there's 50 unique Pokemon in the background running around that all have their textures loaded in, my character's textures are pretty high resolution, there could be 30 NPCs with unique graphics in the background, and then I open that, and now we're loading more textures into memory. These are not low resolution textures. All of this has a cost, which means that's more loading in, loading out, and that is what causes issues with memory. That can result in what is called memory fragmentation. It's a bit, I don't want to get into the jargon of it, but memory fragmentation is like when you watch someone play Tetris and they're really not good at it, and it's just, you just want to scream at them and take the controller and say, no, you're not playing Tetris correctly. You're going to reach the top of the screen. That's what memory fragmentation is for game design. That can occur, and memory leaks can occur due to a whole host of reasons. So that is, again, one of the issues that, or one of the design decisions that is causing issues, is we have so many of these really lovely high resolution textures. I like these thumbnails, but the problem is we also have our high resolution Pokemon thumbnails. They're portraits. These are fantastic. I am not going to say don't do these. I adore them. I really like the artwork here, but the problem is now we can have this high resolution artwork for 435, I don't know the number off the top of my head, let's just say 450. We can have unique high resolution portraits for Pokemon that are loaded in and out. Then we have however many TMs, I don't know. I haven't played through the whole game. I'm going to assume there's maybe around 100 TMs. I'll find out later on once I complete the game. But now we have these high resolution thumbnails. We have NPCs that could be nearby that are loading their high resolution assets. Then we have our items here that these are low resolution, but there's a whole lot of them. And there's hundreds of items in the Pokemon games, and they all have their own unique icons. And the difficulty with these now is that the designer and the developers have to take into account these items are viewable at all time, which means that they always have to be available to be viewed. And there's a risk to loading things in and out repeatedly. That's what causes memory leaks. So as a designer, you have to decide, should this asset be stored in memory and just should it be kept there the whole time? because it's viewed so often, should it be loaded in and out? Because when you load things in and out, again, that's what causes memory leakage. There, again, when you open the boxes, you see that um, these thumbnails load in. Now, I don't 100% know if these are just scaled down versions of um, the high resol pardon me, these high resolution portraits. I don't know if they say scale it down to 25% and then put them in here, or if they used lower resolution. There are benefits and drawbacks to both approaches. If you use lower resolution stuff, then it means that you don't have to load in all of the high resolution portraits, but that also means that now you have to load in, there are instances where you'll have to load in both the low resolution and the high resolution portraits. And so as a developer, you have to do an immense amount of testing to see, do the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. So if they are scaling down the sprites, that means that they are, these are high resolution. These are not the same low poly count pixel art that we've had in the past. If they are loading all of those um, into the box, which I suspect they are because it does take a while to load, that's something that can very quickly cause memory issues. It may not seem like a big deal. As a gamer, you would think, why should that be a problem? It's a major problem because these are not low resolution sprites like we've had in the past, and they're constantly being loaded in and loaded out, and that's going to cause issues. For me, personally, if I were to be faced with these challenges and requirements, despite the fact that I really adore this high resolution artwork, they're fantastic. They're charismatic. For me personally, I think I would have stuck with the low pixel density art style. And the reason why I would have done that is because it eases up the memory pressure. That's much less texture memory that you have to load in and out. So there's one thing again, that a decision that visually it's really fantastic, but it adds so much more pressure to a software where everything else around it is already adding immense pressure to it. Something I noticed that is quite interesting is that, let's just watch these shadows on the ground here. You can see that they are being updated, I think, intermittently. I think that the shadows for environments, I suspect that maybe they aren't being updated every frame. Uh, there seems to be a particular interval at which these shadows are being cast or refreshed. Now, I'm not sure if that is because the light source itself is only being, the position of the light source is being updated at an interval. I'm not sure what technique they're using here, but they do appear to be real-time shadows because they are casting with the same technique that the player character is. But if you have a look at the player character, um, especially when you're running around, these shadows are being updated dynamically. So I suspect the position and the rotation, it's likely just the rotation of the directional light source. I think that's being updated possibly intermittently. It's a bit difficult to tell, but I suspect the decision behind that would be to try to improve performance in some way. But there are many things here, and this is what I'll discuss next, is is your optimization worth it, or is it not worth it? And if we watch these NPCs walk away, this is a major complaint that we have seen online quite often, is we are doing this optimization by reducing the frames at which the animations are being updated. Is that worth it? And I suspect that it is not worth it in this case. It is overkill. And the reason why it's not worth it is because it actively breaks the immersion. Immersion is extremely important when it comes to the enjoyment of a game, and people are reporting they don't enjoy the game because the immersion is constantly being broken. Now, there seems to be a distance check. So characters are checking their distance to the camera so they can decide how much they should cull their animations, how much they should simplify their animations. The problem is that checking your distance to the camera has an expensive cost. It may not seem like a big deal, but it is actually quite expensive. So there's many techniques that you can use to optimize that. For example, um, I develop in Unity, and a much easier way to sort of check that is to cut out the the up and down axis, and depending on the game, I will just check the values between the x and the y, or the z and the x axis, and that is significantly faster, especially when you have multiple objects that are checking the distance to the camera. Now you saw them jittering and turning around, so it's not even just the animation, but is actually the positional values are being updated at an interval. That is a significantly noticeable effect, and it's overkill. There really isn't a reason why you shouldn't refresh the positional data more often, especially because it really isn't that expensive. And if it is expensive, then you have not implemented the movement of your actors in your scene in a way that is scalable. And perhaps you should take a different approach, um, one that is simpler and more efficient. Um, let's see how close I get before their animations. So you can see that that seemed to be the cutoff point right here. An easy solution would be to increase the distance that you have to be from the camera before the characters start simplifying their animations. Um, it is likely that these characters are checking their distance to the camera at an interval, so they're not doing it every frame. If they are distance checking at every frame, that is going to be a significant reason why the frame rate is not great. Um, Games like, for example, we're going to keep going back to Breath of the Wild because it's important when we've been told, look, this is the Breath of the Wild of Pokemon. Then if you say that, people are going to compare this to Breath of the Wild. There is no escaping that. I believe Breath of the Wild performs its distance checking much more efficiently, and there's a strong chance here that the distance for the distance checking logic may be happening every frame in this, and that is not necessary. There's absolutely no reason why that needs to happen because it is extremely expensive. Now, my dogs might bark. I do have cockatoos that tend to jump on my front door. They make a noise, they ask for crackers, and then my dogs start barking. So during this video, my dogs may bark, but that's what dogs do. They bark. I have noticed something as well. Often, when it comes to culling geometry, so when you cull geometry, it means that you're performing some logic and you've decided, okay, let's not draw this because it's not beneficial to draw this. But I can't find a spot right now. But I have been in situations where I've quickly turned the camera, and for 1 or 2 frames, that mountain is not visible. Now, there is some logic to culling what should and shouldn't be drawn, but the problem here is I don't believe it is being implemented in a way that is beneficial to the overall product. Pretty much every single game uses a technique called frustum culling. And I mentioned before that I don't want to use too much jargon, but that's basically anything that is outside of my view will not be drawn. And that is logical. It's not in the camera, so it shouldn't be rendered. You wouldn't think that it is a big deal, but it is a massive deal. But that also means that there's no reason for me to perform any logic to check whether or not that mountain should be drawn. Yet there have been situations where I turn the camera and I can see the mountain wasn't being drawn. And that is an example of you've created this, attempted this optimization that isn't implemented in a way that's beneficial. It's actually causing more harm than good because now people are seeing this break in immersion. So that is an optimization which there should be some better way to implement that without it breaking immersion. There's the next thing I want to move on is while we're here near the foliage is something called translucency on the foliage. Since the sun is coming up, this is a pretty good time to discuss this. What is extremely important, and I'll share this in my project that I'm working on at the moment. I'll share that later in the video. As gamers, we have now been conditioned to see foliage and we expect to see translucency. When you walk outside, and if you look at, say, for example, a tree, and the sun is on the other side of the tree, you're going to see light coming through the tree and the leaves, and it hits the light and it glows in a particular way because now the light is entering that object and illuminating it. Now we expect to see that, and we expect it to look a certain way in video games, and the translucency that I'm seeing here in these games, it's implemented in a way that it's not aesthetically what we are expecting. And that contributes to people saying, oh, the graphics are bad. The reason they're saying that again is because we have been conditioned to, say, for example, Breath of the Wild graphics, which are quite stunning, and it features a gorgeous, very well implemented translucency. The translucency here, for example, these trees, they still look very thick, and at many times it convinces me that maybe there isn't any translucency processing going on with the foliage. As you see the edges there, they're illuminated along the edge of that tree, just the one that my character's facing here. I think scenes like this can be quite nice. You can see the edges are being illuminated. The problem is once I run to the other side of the tree, it's still very dark. It's actually much too dark. And if you have a look at the overall composition of the scene in terms of dynamic, um, and your dynamic range, why is it that the bottom of the tree is the darkest thing in the scene? My character's clothes are black, I have a shadow, the shadows are beneath the tree, yet the bottom of the tree, the leaves there, are the darkest thing in the scene by far. And if you have a look at the trees in the distance, why are the bottoms of the trees so dark? They're significantly darker. Ah, I'm gonna have to. There's a bird outside. Maybe I should just catch the bird and make him my pet. My dog keeps barking at him. Now, this is partly why people say the graphics don't look good, is when you're building a scene, it is extremely important to consider your dynamic range, your difference between your light and your dark. And in this situation, it is the foliage that is really breaking up the visual cohesion and coherence of the scene because the bottoms of the leaves of the trees are way too dark. It's significantly darker than anything else in the scene, and it does not blend well. What we have here is a sun flare. There's many ways to call it. I'm going to call it just a sunbeam effect for now. It's quite visible on the Pokemon centers on their signs in the nighttime. Now, I think this is a very pleasant effect. There are many ways to implement this, but the thing with a sun flare effect is that they are actually, let's say it together, they're quite expensive. They're expensive to draw. This is a very pleasant effect. It adds so much to the environment. I'll have to let my dog outside. Just a moment. I'm sorry. I hope I don't make a bump with this. Now this is quite expensive to process and render. And in my project that I'll show you my examples of how I implemented this and how I'm still fine-tuning it. Because this sort of thing is actually, there are many things to consider when you were implementing this sort of sun flare system or this sunbeam. And in this situation, I think it's quite nice, but I've never seen a single person online comment on this yet and say, gee, these sunbeam effects sure are nice. This really adds something to the game. It's really fantastic. Um, it doesn't seem like people have appreciated and acknowledged this, and I think it's quite nice. I think it's fantastic. The thing is, it's very expensive. It adds a significant cost to the rendering, so this is significantly impacting the frame rate. So not only now are we having to render these expensive sunbeams, but we are also drawing those particles in the distance. We're drawing any items that are generating their own particle effects. We have the any water that's being drawn, even though it's not visible, it is still being rendered. Um, any Pokemon, some are pretty high poly count, and they're animated, and they're, oh, sorry, I bumped into that. So we have the rendering cost of the sunlight, the water, all the particle effects from the items, the dens, any Pokemon that are generating their own particle effects, and now we have every single blade of grass now checking the distance to the camera to see whether they should be blended, calculating how much they should be dither faded. All of this stuff adds up. And something I've noticed as well, and this is from years and years of development in 3D environments, is that the grass is not a a static mesh. It doesn't stay in place. It is designed as a sort of billboard which is always facing the camera. And this is a significant issue. This likely has one of the most um, uh, I don't want to be negative here, but to me, this is one of the most simplest optimizations you could have made. So what is happening here is that every single blade of grass is rotating to face the camera. You can see here, I'll try and move slowly, but you'll see that the grass is rotating to face the camera. Now, each blade of grass isn't an individual. As you step close to them, you can see they're grouped in about, 8 or so. So that is just a clump. We'll call them clumps. But every single clump is rotating to face the camera, and that has a cost. That's quite expensive. Every single clump of grass that you see out in this field is now calculating its position and its rotation, and it's rotating, and that's updating every single frame. That has an impact on the frame rate, um, and it could have been addressed by not having it face the camera. Now, the reason as developers why we would have our grass choose to face the camera is that we are not confident that the grass will look good at every single angle. Because we can move the camera angles quite high and we can rotate it, there's a chance that if we are not careful with the way that we place the grass, then if the grass does not face the camera, it's going to look like a flat sheet of paper. The solution of that is to not use a flat sheet of paper to render your grass. You create a grass mesh that looks interesting. I'll probably plug in Breath of the Wild later on, and I'll show you how Breath of the Wild implements it, because Breath of the Wild's grass does not have to calculate the distance to the camera. It does not have to calculate the rotation, and it doesn't have to calculate a dither transparency. I suspect the grass has a significant impact on performance because, as you can see, there's a lot of it, and now we're also blending colors to simulate the wind. We have it bending to be animated, but also we have grass bend when the player walks over it. This has a performance cost, and you would think it's not that big of a deal, but here's the thing. I can bring out my Pokemon, and now my Pokemon also has collision detection with the grass, and the grass has to calculate that. We think, oh, that's just two things. It's not that big of a deal. Well, if you're out in a field and there's a horde of Pokemon, and there's, 8, 10, 15, 20 of them all walking around in a very grassy field, that's going to have a significant impact on performance because now the grass has to calculate all of those Pokemon. So you can see where all of these things add up. It's not just one small issue that you can fix. It is many things that all have a significant cost to process and render, and they're all coming together to make this more expensive to render. I feel like this scene, for me, in terms of coming from a photographic and a visual design background, what really breaks this for me is the darkness of the trees. Again, translucency is very important. I'll bring up some examples later. But the bottoms of the tree should not be that dark. They should be illuminated from the sun, and they should not be the darkest things in the scene. It tends to break that up. You shouldn't have things that are that dark. So I'm not sure exactly why that decision was made to make them so dark, but it certainly does not help. Another cost that I have noticed is something called inverse kinematics. Now, inverse kinematics is basically your character is checking the angle of the ground that they're on, if there's any uneven slopes, and the character will adjust their legs to stand on that uneven terrain. We've been doing this in games for a very long time, and wow, it is cold outside. I wish that cockatoo would, I don't know, maybe go in a Pokeball for me so I don't have to worry about him chewing on my front door. I'm trying to find some uneven ground here, and I want to get into an encounter so I can explain this. Now that ground is quite flat there, isn't it? Right, let's see, I'll bump into one of these fellows here, and I'll try to explain this, see what my character lands. Okay, Marie. Now, you can see here the Pokemon have actually adjusted themselves to match the angle of the ground. I don't know how they've implemented this, if they are checking the angle of the ground every single frame. If they are, that's not great. It's going to end up costing because there's, again, if it's just one Pokemon doing it, it's not a big deal. The difficulty is there's heaps of Pokemon everywhere. Let's see if I crouch. Right, here's a good example. You can see my character is checking the angle and the unevenness of the terrain, and the legs are adapting to the terrain here. Here, it's not looking so great there, is it? I have noticed in some situations the inverse kinematics actually disables. So say, for example, when the character throws a Pokeball, um, that the character's legs no longer check the ground. So you can see the character's legs are checking the ground here, right? But if I throw a Pokeball, let's watch, you'll see my leg clip through the ground because the inverse kinematics has been disabled. You can see how his legs drop through the terrain just then for um, while he was throwing the ball because the animation for throwing the Pokeball does not take into account. So that means that the logic for determining the inverse kinematics has been disabled. Pardon me. Now, there's something that I do have a slight concern about. I know that there are many effects referred to as post-screen effects. They're effects applied to the whole screen. I might need to get a drink. I'm getting so to pick up where I left off. I know that there are many interesting post-screen effects that this game uses, especially when you're terastalizing. So what I will do is I'll no come here. You will not escape my gaze. I will terastalize and we'll have a look at the effects. So there are many things that become enabled when you terastalize. One such thing, for example, is chromatic aberration. And these are all effects that can become quite expensive over time. So let's have a look here. I'll just terastalize and we'll have a look at the screen. There's chromatic aberration. There's intense bloom. Pardon me. You'll see the chromatic aberration off to the corners of the screen. That has all of those post-screen effects have a cost, especially, you know, we're also casting these really cool beams on the ground. They look fantastic. All of that has a cost. My concern is maybe these effects, they're not being turned off correctly or fully. There's no evidence to support this. It's something that, as a developer, I would just take a few extra steps to ensure that when those effects are not needed, that they are fully turned off. One worry would be, and it's something that can happen very easily, is you dial down the effects, but then you don't actually fully turn them off, which means the logic is still running in the background, which again contributes to issues. It's something that it's an easy mistake to make because it's not very visible as a mistake, and it's worrying that things like that can happen. Now, something that I admire that Game Freak implemented in a way that is quite fantastic is how Pokemon behave differently than each other. I'm going to fly somewhere that's a little more interesting. The AI for the Pokemon, I think, is quite fantastic. I really like that some Pokemon will just follow you around. They'll walk up to you and then they'll look at you with their they got their little face that's kind of like saying, "Hey, catch me, let's be pals," you know. And then you'll have Tauros that will notice you, and then they'll charge you, and they'll stop at nothing until they mow you down. And I think that's just fantastic. You'll have Pokemon that will stay under the trees, and they'll mostly only stay under the trees. You'll have this guy who's just see you later, I'm out of here. I gotta go fast. That guy. Um, and I think that's something that they implemented very well. You'll have that Poison Steel Pokemon. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I've only been playing for a couple days, but he just jets all over the place. I think it's so fantastic. The way that they've implemented the AI is great, but AI has a cost. That is a CPU cost. Pokemon are calculating where to go, what to do, how far they should move. And again, it's not a big deal if there's just one, but you can be in fields full of Pokemon that are densely populated, and then there's an issue. Sorry, the gamer in me, the gamer in me just wants to, I just want to see what this is. Uh, let's see who it is. Oh, it's who's the guy that turns into Dreadnought? Um, Sorry, I've been working so much for the past few years. I didn't get to play a Sword and Shield all the way through. I played most of it. Um, what's his Chootle? Chootle. Chootle. Is that his name? Um, Anyway, I do like Dreadnought. He's a very cool design. Now, there are other. I want to discuss some potential causes for other performance issues, and I'll just briefly go through these. Is Again, I mentioned the hair before. You can see it's animated. That's physics simulation. You know, none of this is real physics, but you can see it's physics simulated. You can have multiple player characters that have physics simulated hair. I haven't put on a dress or anything, so I don't know if dresses have physics simulation. Um, but you again, you have waterfalls and all sorts of other particles. You have high resolution textures that are constantly loading in, and then you have textures that are always present that are just clogging up um, space in memory. Now, the difficulty is that we asked for this. We wanted an open world game from Game Freak, and we were demanding it. But I, I don't know if um, maybe they should be given more time to um, develop their expertise with 3D before we sort of demanded this sort of thing, because this is game is massive in scope. This is part of the AI behavior that I mentioned that I really like. Some wild Pokemon will just follow you, and they're adorable. And I have caught some just because they were following me around, and they kind of seemed like they wanted to be my friend, which is I think that's great that the Pokemon feel so alive in this game compared to Sword and the Shield, where the Pokemon just randomly um, expanded. They Honey, I Shrunk the Kids in reverse out of the grass, and then they all had the exact same behaviors, just walking around, and then they would shrink back into the grass. It wasn't very interesting because they didn't seem like they were living creatures. In this game, they absolutely feel like living creatures, and that is an absolute, um, a huge um, uh, compliment of respect to Game Freak for producing something that feels so alive and interesting. Um, Now, I want to discuss why we don't have indoor areas. This is a complaint that many people have had online. It was a complaint that I had early on when I first heard about it. As a gamer, that's my natural reaction is I really enjoy the indoor areas of Pokemon. Um, but not having them is, again, it's a direct result of the decision behind making this and what it amounts to a single room open world game. And it's not just a single room open world, but it is multiplayer as well. Every single uh, player that's in your union room, you have to exist together. I think there may have been challenges if they were to leave the world and go logically to another void space that stored the information for indoor areas. I believe that would have posed design challenges that would have taken so much development time that it would not have been worth the trouble. I believe that is why we do not have so many indoor areas, because it would have significantly impacted every single other area of the game in terms of the design. It would have taken an immense amount of time, effort, and engineering, and that time and effort was much better spent working on the things that do matter in this game. So while I am disappointed that there are not indoor areas, uh, it was necessary. And that is also partly because indoor areas generally require very high resolution textures. Now you would think, oh no, they're smaller than outdoor areas. It shouldn't matter. It should be easier. That's not true. The camera is much closer to the character in indoor areas, so you require much higher resolution textures to maintain visual fidelity. If you use the low resolution textures indoors, it's going to look absolutely awful. So textures need to be higher resolution indoors. And you would think just on its own in a vacuum, well, that's not a big deal. You can do high resolution textures. That's easy. The problem is there's already so much memory pressure. As we've discussed, there are 450 Pokemon that all have their own graphical assets. You have all of the world terrain textures. You have the buildings that all have their textures. You have the characters. You have the TM thumbnails. You have your item thumbnails. You have your high resolution portraits. All of these things loading memory in and out, that's what's causing issues. That's causing memory pressure. That's causing memory leakage. and it would have made the game much more difficult to develop, and it would have made it worse than it already presents now if there were many indoor areas that were constantly loading in and out. It would have added so many more design challenges for the team. From a developer standpoint, it was absolutely the right decision to not do a large amount of indoor areas. We have some, and I believe that they look absolutely fantastic. For example, the starting house your character wakes up in, I think looks fantastic. I think it's great. It presents well. It's visually coherent. It's interesting. The difficulty comes from the camera maybe not performing collisions great. I want to discuss the camera collisions. Have a quick sip of my room temperature coffee here. Yes, what is next on the old schedule? So, what is going wrong with the collision detection with the camera is, from my analysis, I believe that the camera is casting, well, I'm going to avoid the jargon here. I believe the camera is checking the distance to the ground directly below it, but it is not checking the distance to the right and to the left of it. This is an issue that you run into quite often if your game developers, if your development team does not have a strong um, photographic experience and photographic understanding, is the camera is not this perfect circle and it's not this square. It extends out to the sides, and the corners of your camera can pick up parts of the terrain. Now, I suspect the camera is checking straight down. It's sort of getting a little measuring stick, and it's saying, how far am I to the ground? Oh, I better check to the left. I'll go that way and check left, and I will go that way and check right and see how far things are. The problem is that it's only checking straight down, but if you're on a slope, what they should be doing is checking down there, and they should be checking down there. And it does not look like the cameras are doing that. I'll show you in my project later on that I will put on this video. I use spherical casting. It's a technical term. I'll avoid the technical term. It's sort of, imagine inflating an invisible balloon to the left and to the right of you, and right below you. You're inflating an invisible balloon so that way if anything touches it, the camera can't go through it. That's an effective way to make sure that you don't go through the terrain. And I don't believe that is an approach that the developers took here. And that's why we're going through the terrain in situations. See, in this situation, it's checking quite effectively until you get to a particular slope again. But again, this can happen in any game. I first noticed it as a gamer. I first noticed it in Ocarina of Time, and I thought it was very cool. I actually really liked it. So you can see I'm blocking here, but you can see that it is checking straight down to the left and to the right, but it is not checking an offset distance. And personally, I would have implemented a spherical check. Again, I'll show you later on in my project, so we can see through the terrain here. It's not game breaking, but it is immersion breaking. And get away! So this is the kind of AI that I really appreciate and enjoy. And it's not something that we've seen in previous games in the main series, and I really like that. That this guy's got a little attitude and personality. He saw me and he thought he wanted to flex with me. If I was playing right now, if I was a gamer right now, I'd catch him. I kind of like that feisty attitude. It's just fun. Right now, I'm just trying to explain game development issues with you. Let's go ahead and see what is next. Actually, let's have a look at him. I just want to check if his legs are using inverse kinematics. I think there's a good chance that his legs are using inverse kinematics. Let's go ahead and use this super cool move that I saw on the internet. I just want to copy something I saw on the internet. Oh, I would have made it with a normal jump. So I'm trying to find out if his legs are using inverse kinematics. Oh, he wants to have a go to position themselves on the terrain, or if he's just rotated his body. I believe he's just rotating his body. I don't believe he's using inverse kinematics. That'd be very expensive, but I don't have any humanoid Pokemon with me at the moment to check whether their legs are using inverse kinematics. No, you can see his leg is clipping through the terrain a little bit. So that is the right decision to make, because having inverse kinematics on the legs to position them, perfectly would have been very expensive. And again, it would not have been worth the budget. Again, you have to ask yourself, you're spending your budget on performance and graphics. Is it worth it? It would not have been worth it if every single Pokemon has to check the inverse kinematics. So that is a good design decision there. Let's see. So I want to discuss. Let's see. I think this is a good environment to discuss the terrain, and it seems many people online are not happy with the graphics. And they say that the graphics are bad. So the difficulty, I want to explain the challenges and difficulty that you face, and this is something that I'll show you with my project later on as well. I call it a project. I'm trying to make it seem like I'm like a college student or something. It's a game that's in development, but I'm not here to talk about the games that I'm working on. I just want to focus on Pokemon. So what we're looking at here is different game engines will refer to it as different things. It's a splat map. It's pretty much a painting that tells the terrain where there should be grass, where there should be this sand, and where should be this sand. So I'll be referring to that as a splat map. It's just a set of directions that tells the terrain where to put different textures. Now, for me personally, I would not have used this splat map blending technique. Now, a blending technique is how your terrain mixes. Oh, he's having a go. How your terrain mixes one texture with another. You can see here every single texture. Oh no! Every single texture in the world in this environment uses a basic bilinear filtering. And that basically means that it's smoothing out the borders the best way that it can. It's smoothing it out, but the difficulty with that is the result isn't exactly appealing to the eye. A few years ago, we wouldn't have minded because this was normal, but now players have a much higher expectation. So I might plug in Breath of the Wild later on, and I'll show you Breath of the Wild has far less variety in terms of textures for its terrain, but it uses those textures in a better way. And when by better, I mean that it uses a technique called height map blending. And I'll explain that with Breath of the Wild and with a game that's in development as well, is that it uses data to sort of blend the two together. So they're not just smoothly blended. You can have pebbles, and rocks crossing over into the other texture. You can have blades of grass popping up into the other texture. So a big issue that is resulting in people saying that the graphics are bad is because this is using very outdated bilinear filtering for the splat map, when height map blending is a very available technique. Um, Another major issue that is causing people to say the graphics are bad is that the texture resolutions of the actual texture are quite low. You can see the textures looping quite often. So you can see this sort of patch here. It's again right there. It's also right here. It is also right here. This cockatoo really wants to get into my house. I'm not opening the door though. Please go away, bird. Bird, be gone from here. Maybe if I give him some food. Um, so these are, from a design standpoint, from having designed um, many 3D environments over the years, these are looping far too often. Uh, you can see this rock here. How long before we encounter that particular rock again? Let's see, this rock, so the exact same rock will be here. Uh, the exact same rock is here. The exact same rock is here. And that results in a visual anomaly referred to as tiling. And it looks like tiles in, a kitchen. You can see your kitchen tiles, and they all look exactly the same. Tiling is something, even if you don't consciously think about it, you'll recognize it and you won't like it when it comes, because it does not look organic. You can see this dark spot here. It appears there. You can see the square tile here. Now, the reason why they've tiled so often is because the camera can get very close to the terrain. And the reason why we get so close to the terrain is if we throw a Pokeball, we're very close to it. Now, the difficulty we're facing now is that in certain places, it looks all right. From here, it looks okay. From here, it looks okay. But once you zoom out and you look at it from a distance, there's a sweet spot for it. I would say the sweet spot is probably right here, and it looks all right. Once you zoom out and once you zoom in, it's quite rough. So this is what I refer to personally as scaling integrity for a texture. That's not an official technical term. It's just an in-house development term that I use when I'm making considered decisions involving my design. One thing that could have solved or alleviated, it wouldn't solve it, one thing that would alleviate this tiling issue that people have with the game is to use a higher resolution texture, which means you can have more detail, and it also means that you can tile less. If you doubled the resolution of this texture, for example, or if you doubled the resolution of this texture, then it would be double the distance before the rocks repeat, which alleviates the tiling, and it just looks so much better. But you will still have issues, because if you look at it from a distance, if we look at the mountains, you can see the tiling, and that is something that isn't visually appealing to people. It is something that we are now conditioned, because we've been playing so many other games, we now have been conditioned to expect something that looks nicer and more organic. One approach that could be taken is to use a technique. There's stochastic tiling, something to that effect. I'm still personally doing research on that. I'm not an expert, but that involves having your shader create clumps using your texture data, and then it generates dynamically. It generates clumps which can then be used to show the detail of your terrain, and it means that because it's created these clumps, it no longer tiles, and it looks organic, and there's absolutely no repeating, and it looks much more organic, and you don't have this artificial low detailed look that people aren't exactly excited with. So that is an issue. I've described that, and I've explained a potential solution to it. And again, perhaps at some point during development, we did have higher resolution textures on the terrain. Often when you start out creating your environments, you have high resolution environments, and then you start scaling them back as the other requirements of your game come in. What could have resulted in these low resolution textures is, as I've stated before, we have very high resolution portraits. We have so many icons. We have all these posters and billboards, so many textures on your Poke Centers, your Pokemon Centers. You have everything. If people say, oh, Sword and Shield look better, because Sword and Shield has higher resolution textures, and the reason why Sword and Shield can have higher resolution textures is because you don't have to draw the whole world all at once. In this, they're drawing the entire world all at once. So the fact that they are even able, Game Freak has been able to even create this, that is as stable as it is, that has such an immense amount of content, that has immense amount of textures, varieties, in terms of animated geometry, that is an immense achievement. From a developer standpoint, I cannot help but look back and admire what Game Freak has accomplished here. It's incredible. So it's disappointing to see basically the entire internet criticize this game because it does have technical issues without acknowledging the huge achievements that this game has made. Something I've noticed here as well, again, going along those lines before I move on to the next part of this video, is let's go ahead and open the Poke Portal. You see this texture here? This is a pretty high resolution texture. These are high resolution textures. Let's go ahead and open that. These, again, that's a texture that has to be loaded in and out of memory. Go ahead and back out. Let's see what happens when I click on this. These are all textures that, believe it or not, from a gamer's perspective, it's not a big deal. You think these are the smallest things, they're just icons. So what? Big whoop. It's a big deal on the developer side because these are high resolution. Oh, no, wait, no. I don't want to surprise trade. Please stop. No, I do not want that, please. It, another high resolution texture that needs to be loaded in. Please don't make me trade one of my Pokemon. Please. All of these have to be loaded in and out of memory. They're not insignificant. Uh, so much design consideration has to go into UI because we expect UI to be sharp and detailed and to look engaging and interesting. And that means that all of the various elements of the UI, these windows, this icon, those graphics, all of those have to be high resolution. Um, and all of those, again, contribute to the memory pressure that we are seeing. So it's not a small inconsequential thing. All of these things have to be present at any time. Um, let's see what the shop looks like if we open that. All right. So this is all right. So there isn't, there is some consideration to try to simplify some things. But what I would have, I went skating there for a second, as you can see. That can happen in any game. It's pretty easy for things like that to slip through with development. In the projects that I've worked on in the past, what I would have done with UI elements is to either have the vertical or the horizontal resolution. So instead of it being a perfect square, I would actually scale it and squish it. So maybe it's like that, and then I would stretch that element out later on in the engine, and that effectively halves the amount of uh, memory that it uses for texture. Um, that maybe that could be an approach that they could use for these thumbnails because they look nice, but how important are they? How important is the fidelity of these thumbnails? Is it worth, having the resolution of these, or even absolutely just cutting it into a quarter? You have the vertical and the horizontal scale, and then you just stretch it out in the engine. Because while they are very nice, are they so vital that uh, other elements of the game suffer? For, say, for example, the like the Poke Portal, that background element. Um, I, I, it's possible that they have that at a lower resolution, but it's so sharp, uh, and it's at a resolution that doesn't necessarily contribute that much. So is it worth having to load in and out of memory? Uh, is what I'm trying to explain. Is that maybe if you applied a blur filter and then you cut down the size of that texture to a quarter of what it is, and then stretch that out in the game engine, because artistically and aesthetically it's meant to have a soft blurred look, you would not notice that it is actually half the resolution of what is being drawn on screen. And that is a design consideration that you could make in order to optimize your game, is that it would not be noticeable that it was low resolution anyway. Those are the sort of things that you need to consider when you're designing and optimizing your game. So I hope all of those things were interesting to you. I think I've covered all the topics that I was hoping to cover. What I will do now is I'll very oops, push the wrong button there. I'll very briefly switch into Breath of the Wild just to uh, finish making my point of what people expect to see and why people are not seeing what they expect to see, because we were pitched that this is basically the Breath of the Wild of Pokemon. One thing that I did want to point out again with the Pokemon, especially that I really like with Scarlet and Violet, is Pokemon have specular and normal data. Those are technical terms, but it basically means there's now data um, that tells the game how shiny different parts of the Pokemon are, how bumpy different parts of the Pokemon are, and that is huge. We've never had specular and normal data. Well, there was a little bit in Sword and Shield. So this is what I want to point out with the grass in Breath of the Wild and why it looks so fantastic. It has very good translucency data. You see the light source is in the distance, and there is light shining through the grass, which illuminates it and makes it look very pleasant. There is normal data, which means there's information on how bumpy the grass is, so there's dimensionality to the grass. So having translucency and data on how bumpy the grass is, that adds a huge amount to why it looks so fantastic. If we look at the grass with the sun or the light source to our back, it doesn't have that translucency effect. It's when the light is shining through the grass that looks fantastic. And that is something that Scarlet and Violet do not do. I mentioned before that the grass in Scarlet and Violet were basically billboards, flat billboards basically, that were turning to face the camera. That is not what the grass does in Breath of the Wild, and it allows for a much more dynamic and interesting sense of depth to the grass. So that's a huge part of it. That is absolutely a huge part of it. Let's see here. I'll just go to these trees and we'll have a look at the translucency of these trees. So let's look up through them and you can see, okay, so we have the moon there. And just as we have a look there, you can see the very edges of the trees, they are translucent and they give this really fantastic illuminated edge to the tree, like a silver lining on a cloud. It's so fantastic. There are no erroneously dark points to the tree. How I mentioned in the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the bottom of the tree are extremely dark, whereas the dynamic range in terms of the light and dark on the tree are very well balanced. They're well considered. They don't look artificial, and they blend into the environment because, again, you don't have that intense darkness that's breaking up the visual cohesion of the scene. If we have a look here, we could see the translucency of the leaves, of the moonlight coming through the leaves. It's the kind of translucency that we've come to expect, and it looks quite organic. It's visually coherent, it's consistent, and it just looks fantastic. If we have a look there, when there's just the one branch we are looking at, it's not hyper complex geometry, but it is very well implemented. You can see the light shining through the leaves. If we get to the other side of it, you can see it doesn't have that glowing uh, um, the glowing effect to it because the light is shining on it, not through it from our perspective. It is still processing wind the same way that Scarlet and Violet do, but it's doing it in a way that's more efficient. Now, something I've noticed about Breath of the Wild that adds so much depth to the environment is we have these little billowing um, um, bits of dust that come through intermittently, and they break up the landscape so it isn't just a static, flat landscape we're looking at. This is partly why I believe some people feel that there's a sentiment. People say the graphics are boring, environments are boring, um, the deserts look lifeless, um, and people subconsciously are comparing the game to Breath of the Wild, and people are actively comparing it to Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild feels so alive and active because it uses these particles in a way that keeps the environment moving. In Scarlet and Violet, there are some of these sort of bits of dust that blow through, but it does not do them nearly enough to keep the environments vibrant and moving around. So those are just some examples. You can see the translucency on these bushes. They're not overly dark. They're not overly bright. They blend well with the environment and they break up what would otherwise be an empty landscape. All right, so this is something that's in development. Uh, you can see here, I set out to create an environment that's pretty wide, but you can see one of the issues that we face here. There's so many issues that you face when you're designing anything. Often the things that should work don't work the way that they're supposed to, even though they should. I'll just pick up some items here and we can have a look at some of the examples here. Now this is an environment that I'm trying to, this is a starting area, so I would like it to be detailed and interesting for players to look at. Now I've been doing work, so I've adjusted other aspects which has resulted in the bloom. This is an effect called bloom, and it is in combination with the sunbeam effect, and now it is overpowering. So that is something that needs to be adjusted in game, but I thought I'd share that. This is still in development. Um, this environment features height blending on the terrain. So let's go ahead and zoom in on terrain, and this is running on Switch hardware. So you can see the resolution of the terrain, and you have rocks that come up through the dirt here. This is a result the visual result of height blending. So the rocks have an increased height. They can be layered on top of the grass. If I wanted, I could do the same bilinear smooth filtering that Scarlet and Violet use, and it wouldn't look like this. It would look like Scarlet and Violet just flat blending on top of each other. And that visually is not very interesting. With height map blending, you can get blades of grass, that can layer on top of the soil. Something that I think is important when you set out to create a realistic environment is interaction. So the character's legs can bump into branches and twigs on the ground here. A technique that I use to sort of hide the simple geometry in the distance is to use depth of field. You can bring attention to items in certain places, to certain events. If you want to direct the player in certain ways, you can use depth of field. Now, depth of field is something that Pokemon does use for certain cinematics. And as I mentioned before, I'm worried that perhaps the logic for processing depth of field may not be fully turned off, which means it's constantly just putting performance pressure on the software itself. And if so, it's not difficult. It would be very easy to implement the logic to fully turn off any visual effects that you don't actively need. I think it's important to have interaction with environment. If you're trying to set out to say that this is a living world that your character is in, you have to be able to interact with things like that. Now, I want to point out something here. How quickly the performance of your game can be affected by resolution. So I have the select button that you can press, and it will change the graphics mode between best performance, best graphics, and balance. So in best performance, the overall screen is lower resolution, but that means that any effects that are being processed and rendered will be lower. So all of that sunbeam effect is lower resolution, so it's much easier to render. As you can see, the differences. There's an area where I know that performance starts to drop a bit. So this is best performance, and it's not 1080. It's lower. It's probably closer to the resolution that Scarlet and Violet run in. But what I want to explain is that dropping your resolution even more has a significant improvement on your performance. And if you're using anti-aliasing or anti-aliasing, it may not even be very noticeable that the resolution has dropped substantially. So there are the best graphics, just walk around in this area, balance, where it's sort of in the middle resolution, and best performance. And so my point I'm making is that there are situations where perhaps it may be better to just drop the resolution and to use effective anti-aliasing. And then there are situations where perhaps, pardon me, if you've optimized enough, you may not need to drop the resolution and it will still run just fine. So this is the highest resolution right now for this area here. Right. And so this character is able to eat items. I'm going to eat some of these so I can move faster. I'll just eat a couple of those. I'll eat one more. Okay. You can kick around the bags after he drops them. There's still quite a bit of fine-tuning, but I'll be able to move faster now that I've eaten some of those snacks. You can see the pop in from geometry, and this is always something that's difficult to deal with because you can have a smooth blend for pop in, but that becomes quite expensive because again you have to transition smoothly between the two. There's a rock in the way there. So any sort of open world traversal is always going to be an immense challenge. You can see I'm getting stuck on small rocks on occasion when that shouldn't be an issue. By programming and by design, I shouldn't get caught on small rocks, but it can still happen. It's very difficult because there's so many things that are all interacting and all at play. Again, this bloom effect, I was adjusting something for a different section of the game, and it has affected this so that it's far too bright. So that's something, again, the difficulties with game design is that you adjust something. If your game is massive, all of a sudden you might not even realize you've negatively affected something somewhere else as well. This is a huge benefit, again, as I mentioned, for terrain height map blending, because it allows me to use these small rocks. I can put them over the soil, so that way the soil isn't this single boring texture. You can make it look detailed, and it's almost the exact same technique that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet have used, except they aren't using height map blending. They're using simple bilinear filtering, um, and it the end result you can see is significant. Now here's where visually things start to fall apart. You can see it took weeks to build the environment that I've run through, and now you can see there's this immense world. How much more time would it take to create a visually dense environment and fill all of those environments? You can see I haven't fully populated the details of all those other areas, but for this title, I'm using a sense of depth of field, so it's a little bit blurry out there to hide the fact that it's very simple geometry out there. I'll go to best performance, and I'll go to best graphics. These are the best graphics, best balance, best performance. And you can see, unless you're looking at it very hard, it's tough to tell the difference once it's in motion. It's really, if you're playing on a super high resolution TV, and if a large TV, and when the game is still, then you can really notice it. So what I'll do is I'll turn around, and we'll see that you can see the frame rate drops here. And that's because, as I mentioned before, the sunbeams are quite expensive. Any sort of effect like that, any bloom, has a cost. And those are things that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet have to deal with, that maybe they can improve the way that those systems are handled in an update. See, with best performance, you can see the frame rate increases, and then with best graphics, see the frame rate drops a little bit, and then balance is sort of in the middle. But that's the difficulty, is you want to create these wonderful detailed environments, but they're extremely time consuming, and then you look around and you realize, oh no, I have an immense world that I need to populate with detail. And when you have a very strict development schedule, you're going to quickly realize I don't have enough time to populate absolutely everything and make everything look gorgeous. So it's not a matter of saying, oh, Game Freak doesn't care, or they're not, oh, they're not good at making this kind of game or that game, or they're lazy. It's not that at all. I can see from a development standpoint they have accomplished something incredible. The difficulty is I believe that they need more time for development, and maybe that just isn't feasible. Unfortunately, there are very strict requirements on them. I believe they do an incredible job with what they've accomplished. Um, from a technical standpoint, I'm shocked that Scarlet and Violet feel though like they're so creative, they're so full of life. I feel like there's an immense amount of passion that went into it. One more important thing I want to discuss when it comes to the visuals of a game, especially when you are trying to present an immersive, uh, realistic environment, or one that is realistic in terms of light and shadow, is the use of volumetric lighting. So again, I want to avoid too much jargon here, but volumetric lighting basically simulates the light that is coming from a light source like the sun, and you want to simulate it passing through the particles in the air and the atmosphere, and that colors the light, and it makes the environment glow and feel like it exists in a world that has atmospheric density to it. So here I've used atmospheric or volumetric lighting. So it's not the same thing as say, for example, fog, which is something we used in video games for many years as a simple effect. But the volumetric lighting simulates the sunset light passing through the moisture in the air, sort of creating this warm look. If I sort of stuck on a log there, if I try to look out into the distance there, too bright, you can see there's this hazy color to it as the sunlight is passing through. Um, what can I look? See, there's again, this is one of the issues that you face, is you have to be so active with watching where your terrain tiles, and then having to work around it and then adding more details, and that is extremely time consuming. It's such a difficult challenge that we face as developers, and so there are many techniques that you can use. So this environment isn't finished, but you can see when it's partially, or when it's unfinished, you can see how bad it really can look. So I'm just going to run up here, and let's have a look off the edge here. and we'll see if we can get an example of some volumetric lighting in the distance here. So volumetric lighting can also help your terrain blend better. For example, as we're looking at some terrain in the distance, and it feels like there's this haziness and the light passing through. It looks like it's farther away in the distance, and ultimately it does sort of blend with the from a video game standpoint, it blends with the skybox, or it blends with the sky. Now you can see I'm not drawing shadows out there to save on processing, but it results in that flat look. And unfortunately, that's one thing I have to accept as a developer, is I can't afford to draw shadows all the way out there. It's too expensive. But at least the distance fades into the skybox, so it feels like it is there is a dense atmosphere that makes it feel like a real place. One graphical issue that I'm still dealing with is that the fog can flicker, and this is again one thing where, oh, it really shouldn't be doing this, but it is doing it anyway. There are many challenges we face as game developers. Breath of the Wild extremely effectively uses height fog, and it uses volumetric lighting to create a real sense of atmospheric depth. So you can see just sort of fading to the color of the um, sky adds a lot of depth to your scene. And again, this is in development. That setting is way too high on that. I increased the sensitivity for a different part of the game. So I'll just briefly go back to um, Violet and Scarlet, and we'll see what the terrain looks like. And this is partly why people say that the graphics don't look good. Is I feel that they probably should have implemented or simulated some degree of volumetric lighting. What they have implemented is a simple distanced fog, and you can see that this looks quite flat because there is no volumetric lighting. Light should be passing through the clouds, giving a very pale, almost a blue glow, and it should be affecting the colors of the terrain here, and it really isn't. Um, you can see far, far off in the distance, it kind of gets soft and goes a little blue, and it sort of matches the sky, but it's not enough because the ground that is nearby, you can see all of this, it looks quite flat because it's all basically the same color, and there isn't enough detail breaking up that. One very simple way to fake volumetric lighting is just to make the fog start sooner. So the fog, which they have used as simple a distance fog, is to have that start sooner, but to be thinner, so that as I'm standing here, you see where I'm looking at that right there. That should not be the same color as the ground that I'm standing on. It looks very dull and flat, and this is why people online are saying the game looks like an N64 game, it looks like a 3DS game, because we are accustomed to seeing volumetric lighting that makes our environments look dynamic and have a sense of depth. That is missing here, and there are ways to fake that, again, because volumetric lighting can be quite expensive. But again, it's a situation of, okay, you're spending your budget on volumetric lighting, but is it worth it? And in this situation, it absolutely would be. I feel like that should be a priority, is to give a better sense of a lived-in atmosphere, because again, the colors here where I'm standing shouldn't be the exact same color that we're looking at there. It just results in a look that is not as dynamic as people expect, especially since we've posed this game to be similar to Breath of the Wild. Before I finish, I want to point off, oh, I've bumped into a shepherd. Okay, there is a visual effect here that I quite respect and admire. I really like this, and that is the blending of, say for example, the terrain with objects. So you can see the terrain. It's a bit tough to really see, but you can see it isn't just a flat line. There is a dither that occurs between the terrain and this rock here, and it's a sort of a dithering fade that goes from the terrain to the rock, and it gives it a nice sense of visual cohesion. It makes it look like they are in the same environment and that they are organic. In other games, if you don't have blending like that, then it is just a flat, solid line, and you see the boundary, and it looks very sharp and unorganic. So That is something that I think looks great. It's more apparent here, but at the same time, that has a cost. In this situation, I believe the cost is absolutely worth it, because if you did not have that dithering blend, it would look harsher on the eyes. It would look less organic. So I feel that it would um, benefit the game if the developers had made more decisions like this, where they spend their rendering and the processing budget on a bit more of the presentation that people will be staring at up close. So that's all that I wanted to share today. I hope that was interesting to you. I hope my insight has brought some appreciation to what Scarlet and Violet have accomplished. Um, and I just hope that people enjoy the games, um, and continue enjoying Nintendo stuff. I think we're lucky to be getting so many great games so close together, and there's so many things to look forward to. So I appreciate you watching this. If you would like to see me break down more games and explain the technical stuff behind it, how those games work, what could be causing issues, what could be adjusted to improve certain things, please let me know. Let me comment. Let me know what you thought of this video, and let me know if you are enjoying Scarlet and Violet. I'm enjoying them, but I can only play them in small bits and pieces. I'm quite busy with my work. I'm a full-time game developer. Um, so fortunately, when I create a build of my games, they can take, sometimes they can take 15 minutes, sometimes they can take half an hour. I can power on my Switch and I can play some games here and there. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope that I'll see you again soon. All right, you will.